Today, we are observing the World Food Day's 75th anniversary. More than 2 billion people worldwide lack access to safe and nutritious food, and this year the need for help is even greater due to the coronavirus pandemic. In the U.S., the average number of newly confirmed cases of coronavirus has grown to roughly 50,000 new infections every day. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 7.9 million Americans tested positive for the virus. The economic impact hit millions more. There are currently still more than 25 million Americans receiving some form of unemployment aid. This means more Americans have less money to feed their families. And according to the Rockefeller Foundation, 40% of Americans are unable to access $400 in times of emergency. 1/3 of households across the country are struggling to afford the amount and quality of food they would like. In addition, an estimated 30 million students are at risk of losing the meals they need due to school closures across the country. The pandemic has emphasized the issue of food insecurity and racial disparity in the U.S. The Rockefeller Foundation recently published a report titled "Reset the Table: Meeting the Moment to Transform the U.S. Food System." It highlights the steps the country needs to take to combat the growing food crisis. And joining us now is Devon Klatell. She is the managing director of the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. Devon, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Tanya.
So, Devon, your organization has gathered a diverse group of more than 100 experts, and together they lay out a plan to tackle the global food crisis. Tell us who these professionals are and what steps do they suggest we take as a country to combat this growing food crisis?
Yeah, we were incredibly privileged this spring and summer to have a series of conversations with over 100 practitioners, policymakers, researchers, community groups that have long been working on the food system in the United States. And the conversation we had revealed the massive impact that the COVID health crisis and resulting economic crisis has had on millions of Americans. You just laid out a number of tragically stunning statistics about the hunger needs in the U.S. at the moment. But what we also heard is that while COVID exacerbated a lot of these problems, many of these problems existed pre-COVID and will continue to exist after we address the COVID pandemic if we don't make longer-term change. And so what we tried to lay out in the report is sort of a synthesis of these three shifts, which you briefly had on the screen there. Moving towards a better resourced, more integrated nutrition security system that delivers nutritious foods to all Americans, partnering closely with the health and education sectors, reinvigorating regional and local systems, including investing in infrastructure at those levels to rebalance a national food system that is efficient but also resilient. And then lastly, using policy tools and practices to ensure that prosperity is shared equitably throughout the supply chain, particularly thinking about food and farm workers and communities of color who often don't have the economic stability as strongly as other actors in the chain.
And Devon, as you just noted, the coronavirus did not create these flaws within the U.S. food system, but exposed the tremendous issues that already existed to some degree in the supply chain and the way people across the country access their meals, which of course the global pandemic exacerbated. But when you look back at, the entire system, where were the weakest links?
I think we learned this year more than ever before the critical role of schools as anchors in community feeding and nutrition. When schools started to shut down in the spring, we really saw food insecurity rates start to spike. And it's critical that we continue to invest in the resources that schools need to serve children in their communities. We saw massive supply chain disruptions, particularly between farm and food recovery and rescue organizations. There's been some incredible innovation since those early disruptions to try to solve for that problem, but I think it points to a longer-term need to better connect producers through secondary markets with some actors like food banks in that system. And then, I don't know if this is a supply chain disruption, but I think COVID has really highlighted the connection between diet-related disease and health outcomes. Recent CDC report highlighted that 76% of COVID cases, the severity of illness was tied to an underlying condition. And the vast majority of those are diet-related conditions or diseases. So I think that also really came to light this past year.
And as you mentioned, this pandemic has just highlighted how important those school meals are. And school closures have put 30 million students across the country at risk of losing the meals they need in order to remain healthy, as you were telling us. So, we don't know when schools are going to open. We don't know when things are going to be totally back to normal. So is there a proposal on the table for how we can go about feeding these children if schools do remain closed in large parts of the country? And whose role is it to do that?
A really important question. And the question of schools is one I think parents like me think about every day. I think when it comes to school nutrition programs, first I want to really celebrate the thousands of school nutrition professionals across the country that were so innovative in getting food out. I mean, some school districts closed on a Friday, and by Monday, those professionals were getting food to families through driveways with school buses, with grab-and-go meals. But what they need is resourcing and public support and public dollars. And thankfully, USDA recently extended some waivers that provide flexibility for school districts and how they can deliver those meals. But we've also seen that those schools are taking on huge financial deficits to continue to deliver meals in these extraordinary times. And we absolutely have to think about how to make those school districts whole and continue to support them financially, and to think about how we can serve universal access to students, in the long term. Pandemic flexibilities have shown that students need to be able to access school meals without having to go through bureaucratic hoops, and school administrators need to be able to serve meals without needing to jump through those same hoops. So I think it's financial resourcing in the short term and making schools whole, and then thinking about policy change in the long term that enables that food delivery.
Mm-hmm. And to get back to this issue of food delivery and weaknesses in the food supply chain, we saw a disproportionate number of meat and poultry workers contract COVID-19 as they continued working during the pandemic. Farmers, as you mentioned, struggling to stay afloat as restaurants closed across the country. So, what more can you tell us about a shift to a regional supply system and the way that might work?
Yeah, a really important question. I think, our national supply chain is incredibly good at delivering food efficiently and safely, but we've seen this past year it's not very resilient. And the areas that were most resilient were those that had robust local and regional supply chains. And I think there's a couple things we can do to support stronger regional and local food systems. One is make better use of our public dollars. Taxpayer dollars in this country flow to food purchases in the billions through programs like the school lunch program, through correctional facilities, through hospitals, through agencies like the DoD, and using those dollars to support a diverse array of producers and local and regional infrastructure is one way that we can really help to build up those systems. Several states have piloted this already by providing local purchasing incentives to school programs, 10 to 25 cents per meal, in extra spending power if they put those dollars to work in local and regional systems. So I think that's one really important change we could make. And then, of course, there's other investments and policy changes related to agricultural financing, loan and credit, that would go a long way to helping those producers be economically stable. And the last thing I just want to say is there are community groups and grassroots organizations doing incredible work in this area all over the country. Right. Building up food hubs that connect producers and consumers in really innovative new ways. And they should be the ones really answering this question of what will work best for them at the local level.
It's so interesting how when you think about food and you think about, a food supply chain, it just makes sense that it should be as local as possible, not just, for immediacy and freshness of the produce, but just also for the environment. There's so many reasons that, supporting a local supply chain, seems to make sense. But Devon, overall, what would you consider now to be the greatest obstacle that stands in the way? Because you just laid out, a bunch of great proposals. These are great ideas that were laid out by the best, minds in this field. What's the greatest obstacle that stands in the way to start implementing some of these things?
I think we need to do a better job of making clear how the food system supports outcomes that the majority of Americans and policymakers care about, things like economic development, health outcomes, equity outcomes. and really taking into account the full cost and benefit of some of these programs when we're making policy decisions and evaluating these kind of innovations. I think for too long, the food system hasn't been a sort of top 10 priority issue when it comes to national conversation. And we're in an election year where we're talking a lot about policy change. And I think making sure people understand the way the food system affects all of us in our communities is a really important part of getting to long-term change.
Absolutely. Well, Devon Klatell, Managing Director of the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation, thank you so much for joining us and discussing this really, really important topic that affects so many Americans. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tanya.